And so here we are at what was known at the time as the Great War, sometimes known as the War to End All Wars, and now most commonly referred to as World War One. In America, we tend to not give it as much attention as World War II, whereas in Europe, it's every bit as much of a big deal. And honestly, in world history, it's as at least as big a deal as World War II because World War II is sort of a continuation of this war with a good 20-year pause in the middle. But let's go ahead and get started with the war. So the war will begin in 1914 and last until 1918. The peace treaties will be fulfilled in 1919. So it's a long war. And what starts it, what causes it, are basically three major things: nationalism, imperialism, and treaty obligations, an interlocking set of treaty obligations. And we're going to discuss each of those individual items, individually. So, nationalism is an intense feeling of pride, love, for patriotism, for your nation. Now, as a nation, we don't necessarily mean a political entity. It's often more of an ethnic group situation. You can be both a nation ethnically and a nation politically, a state, and that's called being a nation state. Uh, and so nationalism can be a unifying factor in that when you have a nation that has a common culture, a common ethnicity that comes together, it tends to be a stronger nation, more unified. And that's what's going to happen in the late 1800s in both Germany and Italy. They will both finally unite and become unified nation states, largely because of nationalist feeling in the late 1800s. The problem is nationalism can also be a separating kind of thing, where if you have a multi-ethnic empire, and there were several in Europe at the time, the Russians were a multi-ethnic empire, the Ottomans were a multi-ethnic empire, the Austro-Hungarians are a multi-ethnic empire. These are going to be threatened by nationalism within their borders as different ethnic groups seek to escape domination by the dominant ethnic group of the empire. That would be Austrian German types for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That would be Russians in the Russian Empire, and that would be Ottoman Turks in the Ottoman Empire. But for example, the Ottoman Empire held uh, Greece and Serbia and other parts of the Balkans in Europe for a few centuries. And they had had rebellions all throughout the 1800s, eventually losing those areas to independence as Western European nations sort of stepped in and said to the Ottomans, yes, you're going to let these people be free. So it can threaten to break up empires. And this is going to be really important with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and its neighboring nation, Serbia, which had broken away from the Ottoman Empire only a few years before the Great War begins, and had a shared border with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And on one side of the border, there were some Serbians living, and they want to unify. So the nationalism is becoming a problem there as well. And the last thing about nationalism that helps to cause this war is, like I said earlier, with the definition of nationalism, has to do with pride, right? It's this intense feeling of pride. My country is the best, is the idea. And if anybody doubts that, if anybody says otherwise or proves otherwise, in the case of, for example, the Franco-Prussian War from 1870, where France was humiliated by the Prussians, who then created the German Empire as a result of winning that war. France was humiliated by it. They're still angry. It's been 40 years, and they're still mad at the Germans. and they want revenge. It's simple as that. They want revenge for this humiliation. So the next issue that is going to be one of the causes of the Great War is imperialism. And what that is the drive for an empire. And the big powers, the great powers of Europe, places like Germany, England, the UK, France, Russia, Italy, these guys are all looking to create, grow, build their empires. It's a source of great wealth. It's a source of prestige and influence. And so they're looking to do this. Now, in Europe, they really don't struggle much during most of the 19th century, the 1800s. There's some towards the end, the Franco-Prussian War, for example, which helped to unify Germany. But there's not a major war. That's the first really major war in Europe after the defeat of Napoleon, which was way back in 1815, and after which they had a big meeting called the Congress of Vienna, where they set up a sort of a balance of powers so that no one nation was too strong. Well, in 1870, Prussia unifies all of Germany, and all of a sudden there's a big, strong country there, and that's going to offset that balance quite a bit. Their competition and conflict, however, mostly takes place overseas in the struggle for colonies in places like Africa, Asia, the Pacific Islands. These colonies are a good way of providing wealth, and it's a frontier area for the peoples of Europe. And we've talked a little bit about how important frontier areas are for the Americans previously, when the frontier closed under Frederick Jackson Turner says, well, the frontier is closed and we start looking outward. Same thing is going on with the Europeans. They don't really have any frontiers internally, so they're looking elsewhere. In particular, Germany is doing this. The way they put it is that Germany is looking for its place in the sun, to be out there as an empire along with their rivals, the United Kingdom, France. Even little old Belgium had a empire that they were very proud of, very happy with, and Germany really didn't. And so Germany, the German rulers, Kaiser Wilhelm and his chancellor, the guy who was really kind of running the show for most of it, was Otto von Bismarck. And they decide that they are going to create a new German empire as Germany looks for, again, as they put it, their place in the sun. And here's a cartoon showing how serious they were about it. The main figure there is Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany. He's the guy that's running the show. He's not the king. He's not the emperor. He works for the emperor, but the emperor pretty much lets him run the government, run the business. In 1884, Bismarck calls a conference in Berlin. The foreign ministers of several of the major nations come: Italy, the UK, France, Russia, and they basically carve up Africa. Now, this is a French cartoon. That's why Africa is spelled the way it is. That's the French spelling. But they basically carve up Africa and they say, okay, France, you get these parts, and Britain, you get these parts. Germany is going to take these parts. Italy gets this bit. Belgium gets this bit. Russia, you don't get anything. So the third thing that is going to make World War I the huge conflict that it becomes, rather than just a small conflict between one or two nations, is a network of treaty obligations that existed. The European nations have become very wary of their rivals. They've been fighting rivalry wars in far off places, not in Europe, but they're very nervous about their rivals. And so as a result, all of these countries look for friends. They make mutual defense alliances, sign treaties with one another. And basically there's two main networks for the big powers at any rate. One is called the Triple Entente, and that's Britain, France, and Russia. The other is the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy. When the war begins, Italy will actually back out of this alliance. They don't get involved and will eventually actually come in on the Allied side, the Triple Entente's side. However, the Ottoman Turks will join the Germans and the Austrians because they're opposed to the Russians and the French and the British. So there will still be three relatively major countries in the Triple Alliance. These guys get known as the Central Powers, whereas the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia, become known as the Allied Powers. And later on, of course, the United States will join that side. Part of the problem is some of these treaties are secret. So other people, other countries don't know exactly what they're getting into, what they'd be biting off if they went to war with, say, Germany. Okay. If they had a secret, if Germany had a secret alliance, a secret treaty with the Austro-Hungarians, then France might declare war on Germany and find itself in a war with both Germany and the Austro-Hungarians, the Austrians, not knowing that they would be picking up both. And so that causes some miscalculations in the war as well. When things are primed, the world is just sort of looking at Europe. Europe has become kind of a powder keg. It's been a long time since they had a major war. It had been 40 years since the last really big European war. And they're overdue. That was a long time for Europe to not have a fairly substantial war. And tensions have been mounting, and we get to the point where there's going to be a spark that sets everything off. So if we were in class, I would be drawing something like this up on the dry erase board, but we're not, so I added this slide for this video lecture version. And I like it because it shows how the different major countries have those interlocking webs of alliances. And it's got Serbia in the middle. And that's important because that's really where the spark that's going to start everything comes from. And so we'll talk about that in just a minute. But it's a nice graphic representation of how everybody starts to get pulled towards one another in this war. This graph shows the relative power of the armies in Europe as of 1914. The Russians have by far the largest army, almost 6 million people at the start of the war. That's a big army, but it's really spread out. Russia's huge, and they've got troops all over the dadgum place. The French have almost 4 million, or just at 4 million, and the British have somewhere around 800,000 at the start of the war. Now, the British and the French are spread out around the world because they have empires around the world. Now, most of the French are in France, but only about half or so of the British troops overall are going to be standing in Europe. Austria-Hungary's got about 3 million, according to this, and about 4.5 million in Germany at the start of 1914. By comparison, the United States Army in 1914, when this war broke out, was a total of 98,000 men, with 27,000 in the National Guards. So we had virtually no army. The Marines were less than 20,000 total. Our forces were very small, and that was traditionally a thing in the U.S. This is a topic we've discussed before, and we'll repeat again, is that we have never, up to this point in history, had a large standing army. The U.S. government is not a fan of that concept because of their brush back in the old days with the British and their standing army, which was used, as you hopefully remember, to enforce their laws and their rules on us, and we didn't care for that. So we'd always worried about that being a tool for a tyrant, having too large of an army here at home. So with all of this nationalism, all of this imperialism, all of these worries and alliances and things, people were looking at Europe and saying that it was a powder keg. That was a description used quite often. Otto von Bismarck, the fellow who had helped carve up Africa and had led Germany for many years, as the Iron Chancellor was his nickname, had even said that the next great war in Europe would be fought over some damned thing in the Balkans, an area to the southeastern part of Europe, near Greece and Serbia and all in that area. And he's right. The spark that sets off the powder keg is going to happen on June 28th of 1914. The Austrian Archduke, a fellow by the name of Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie are going to be assassinated in the city of Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. Princip is a member of a terrorist organization known as the Black Hand. They're supported by Serbian army officers who had helped get them weapons and explosives and things like that. Princip and the Black Hand want the empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to give up part of their territory that was full of Serbs, but that was not obviously Serbia. There was a border dividing them. And so this is where nationalism comes in. The Emperor Franz Joseph, and that's him in the picture on the right-hand side there, refuses to do so. They had asked several times. He always refused. And he blames Serbia, not the Black Hand, but Serbia, the nation, for the murder of his heir. Now, the interesting thing is they weren't even very close. The relationship between the two men was not close. Archduke Ferdinand had married a woman named Sophie. She was noble, but she wasn't of the high nobility, and so Franz Joseph, the emperor, really didn't like the idea of her marrying into the royal imperial family. So he made it where in order for them to be allowed to be married, they had to agree that none of their children would ever inherit the throne. So after Franz Ferdinand died, then it would go to one of his cousins rather than to his children by Sophie. And they agreed to that because he was just infatuated with Sophie, and so they married. It was a nice little love story. Franz Joseph blames Serbia and sets all sorts of demands on the Serbs, which they try their best to meet. They simply can't meet them all, however. And so a month later, on July 28th, Austria will declare war on Serbia. And at that point, we have the first shots, the first step of the war taking place. This is the area in question, circled in red there. That's the part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that is full of Serbs, but is part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the city of Sarajevo, that's marked there with the yellow arrow. So that's where this is taking place. Over to the left, to the west, you can see Italy. To the east, you can see Bulgaria and Romania. So just to give you an idea. And here's a picture of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That's him on the right. And a newspaper picture of, obviously not a photograph, but depiction of the assassination. It's not exactly how it happened. What had happened was that Franz Ferdinand and Sophie had gone to Sarajevo in order to, he's doing the royal thing where he's opening a hospital and, officially opening it and sort of showing that the royal family cares about the little people here in the small city of Sarajevo, that sort of thing. And so there's a parade through town, and the Black Hand had attempted to kill him during the parade. And one of them threw a bomb, which went under the wrong car and blew up and injured several of the people, the servants of the Archduke and his wife. And so, of course, the parade collapses in pandemonium. They rush the emperor's heir off out of to a place of safety. They take the injured people to the hospital. Then Franz Ferdinand is on his way to the hospital to see the injured people who had been injured in his service. It was sort of one of the things that was expected of you if someone was hurt in your service back in those days, was to take care of them. And his driver has gotten lost. And he stops and he starts to turn around in these narrow little streets. And lo and behold, right there next to them as they come to a stop is this fellow, Gavrilo Princip. And he missed his chance at the parade. He looks at this as divine providence. He pulls a revolver out, sticks it through the window, and shoots. And he kills both Sophie and the Archduke with several shots. The driver later said that the Archduke's final words were, "Sophie, don't die. Think of the children." Unfortunately, Sophie was actually already dead. She died basically instantly. He died in moments. Princip is captured, and he will attempt to escape and get shot and dies. But he was dying of tuberculosis anyway. He was never going to make a trial. But once this happens, once Austria has declared war on Serbia, that's when those interlocking alliances start to kick in. Serbia cannot take on Austria. Okay, Serbia is not big enough to take on Austria. That's why they're trying to do this sort of on the sly. So they call on their alliance with Russia. And Russia was sort of these small Slavic nations like Serbia's big cousin. And so they call on their big tough cousin Russia. And so the Russian Tsar Nicholas and his government respond with, okay, we'll try to scare them off. And they start to mobilize, and they warn the Austrians, hey, back off or else. Now, the Austrians have a big friend next door called Germany, which is led by Kaiser Wilhelm. And so they call on their alliance and say, hey, Germany, Russia's being mean to us. Come help. And so Germany begins to mobilize. Well, an interesting thing about this is that the leaders, the rulers of both of these countries are cousins. They're actually cousins, and they had spent a lot of time growing up together. Their mothers were sisters. And so they were actually friends and had grown up that way. And so through the month of July, as things get worse and worse, they send a series of telegrams back and forth to one another before the war begins because they're trying to avoid war. Neither one of them wants to fight the other for personal as well as professional political reasons. And they start off very warm and friendly, and as they go on, and we have copies of these, they're public documents now. They get more and more cold and official in tone as they get closer and closer to deadlines for starting this war. And they're called the Willie Nicky telegrams because that's how they signed them. That's what they called one another, was Willie and Nicky. So they each try to get the other to take the first step to avoid a war. Hey, if you'll stop mobilizing your army, I can stop mobilizing mine, and we'll be great. But I can't stop until you stop, because if you continue to mobilize and I don't, then you could jump us before we're ready, and I can't let that happen. And so both of them have trouble being able to back down, and so their governments just keep moving towards a war that really the rulers didn't particularly want. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, is cousins with Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Well, they've got another cousin who's ruling yet another nation of Europe, and that's King George V of the United Kingdom. And they're all related because they're all descended from Queen Victoria, who had ruled England for a very long time, over 60 years, from 1837 until her death in 1901. King George's father was Edward, and two of his sisters, he had something like 7 or 8 siblings. I forget exactly how many kids Victoria had, but it was quite a few. She actually has the nickname the Grandmother of Europe, because her children married off to all of these royal families. One of the daughters married the Tsar of Russia. Her son became Tsar Nicholas II. And you can definitely see, look at the two of them, Tsar Nicholas II and King George V. There's a very strong family resemblance there. Kaiser Wilhelm, his mother was also one of Victoria's daughters, although he looks more like his father. The strange thing is, Wilhelm did not like George. He was very jealous of his cousin, King George V, because of George's empire, the size of his empire, and the power of his navy. Wilhelm was trying to build up the Kriegsmarine, which is the German navy, to rival the UK's, and that was just a long way to go. The Royal Navy at the time, by far the biggest, most powerful navy in the world. And so they were kind of not real friendly to one another anyway. Tsar Nicholas, he wasn't very close to George either, although their nations were allied at least. And so with Austria declaring war on Serbia at the end of July, the dominoes begin to fall. Serbia calls on Russia to help. Russia begins to mobilize. Austria calls on Germany to help. Germany begins to mobilize. On August 1st, Germany will declare war on Russia. And to me, this marks the beginning of actually World War I. There's a saying, it's called the Guns of August, where they begin the fighting of the Great War. It begins in August of 1914. And to me, that's really the point at which it goes from being a small war, or what could have been a small war between Austria and Serbia, it would have been the Austro-Serbian War, into the Great War, World War I, because the dominoes just continue to fall one after the other, okay? So Germany declares war on Russia. 2 days later, they declare war on France. Then they invade Belgium. This is part of a plan that they've got, which we'll talk about here in just a second, called the Von Schlieffen Plan. to fight a war against both France and Russia. And the reason for that is because Germany's in between the two. And as a result of Germany invading Belgium, Britain will declare war on Germany because Britain had signed a treaty with Belgium saying that they would protect Belgium against any aggression. This is a map of the European continent at the beginning of the war, 1914. And there you can see in the center those sort of pinkish colors. Those are the Central Powers: Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, one of the lesser powers in the group, but still important, and the Ottoman Turks down there to the southeast, Turkey. Arrayed against them are the Allied powers, that sort of greenish color. That would be the United Kingdom, Russia, Finland, France, Italy, and Portugal, along with some of the smaller nations: Romania, Serbia, Albania, Montenegro, Greece, all of them. Now, Algeria and Morocco down there in the south, those are colonies of France at the time. Those yellowish colors, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, and so on, Spain, those are neutral countries. These are countries that took neither side and so stayed out of the war. So you can see how Germany is stuck in between two powerful nations. Russia, which is huge, it's immense. Remember, they've got that great big army. Now that army is spread out a long ways, and so it's going to take them a long time to get it all together to be ready to fight. And France, who has just traditionally been one of Germany's enemies. So with enemies on both sides, Germany is kind of nervous. You never want to fight a war where you're splitting your forces up to fight two different wars, essentially. That's a good way to lose a war. And so they had come up with a plan, and all countries do this. We have plans for wars against pretty much anybody we would ever fight. We've even had plans for wars against Canada, of all things, but countries do this. They set up plans to fight different wars based on different scenarios. And in this case, the big worry for Germany is that they go to war with both France and Russia at the same time. They know that France and Russia are allies. They know that we're stuck in the middle between them and that it's going to be a bad sort of thing. And so they had created a plan. The head of the German General Staff back in 1905, a fellow by the name of Alfred von Schlieffen, kind of a funny name, but fun to say. Alfred von Schlieffen had created this plan, so it's called the Schlieffen Plan. And the idea is pretty simple. Stack almost all of your army on the western side. Attack and defeat France immediately, as soon as war begins. Just swarm them. This is essentially what they had done back in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. They beat the French in like 6 weeks. Okay, it was a very short-lived war. So the idea is we're going to stack up our armies on the western side, beat France, and then rush east to fight Russia. This counts on the fact that Russia is going to take a while to be ready to fight. Okay, they don't have a lot of railroads. They don't have good roads in any way. They don't have lots of trucks. It's going to take the Russians a long time to mobilize, to get their troops, to bring up their reserves, to arm everybody and get them in place to fight Germany. Okay, so the plan says within 39 days, Paris should fall. We should capture Paris in 39 days, and with 3 days after that, France should capitulate, should surrender to us. The war will be over. That's 6 weeks from the start of the war. And then all of our soldiers will get on these trains and haul butt back to the east. And y'all, they had this plan worked out to the point where very small groups of soldiers had orders to be at a certain train station on a certain day, 42 days after we invade France, you need to be at this train station at 2 in the afternoon. Your train is going to arrive for you to load up on and head east. And we will have a train there. That's how detailed this plan is. I mean, it's incredibly complex. And they train on it. They train on it for years. Everybody knows this plan because the Germans aren't very secretive about it. Okay, they want people to know, look, we're ready for y'all. Don't mess with us. We're ready for you. Okay. Unfortunately, The plan will be adjusted by von Schlieffen's successor, a fellow by the name of von Moltke. Von, by the way, is a German thing that means that you're a noble. Okay, it's like count. They just throw it in their name to indicate that they're a noble. Anyway, so Helmuth von Moltke is the guy who takes over after Schlieffen retires, because Schlieffen's getting fairly old. He reduces the strength of the invading forces for France. He's a little bit more worried about Russia mobilizing fast. And so he keeps more of his troops to the east and does not put as many to the west. And the problem with that is that it is they fail to meet this timetable. Okay. Had von Moltke not done that, could they have won? Maybe, because they got very, very close to taking Paris at the beginning of the war. And so this is a map showing basically the Schlieffen Plan's concept. Sweep through Belgium, around Paris, cut it off from the rest of France. Everybody else slams into Paris, and we capture the capital. The French government collapses. It is expected to counter the known French plan, which was called Plan 17. And then everybody would jump on their trains and go back over to the other coast, or not coast, but border. And here we have a newspaper, the New York Evening World, which, you see, it's only a penny for the paper, printed on Saturday, August 1st, 1914, announcing the declaration of Germany declaring war and the rise of the war in Europe. Also points out that Italy broke the Triple Alliance and that France was calling for her war army to go. But we also to show you how big of a deal it is here in America, we also have our baseball scores there on the front page. So it's a big deal, but we're not involved. It's a European thing. It's just news to us. So how does the U.S. react to the outbreak of war? Well, we say not our problem, basically. Neutrality is the stance, that's what this is called, neutrality, was the stance taken by the majority of Americans towards the war, at least at the start of the war. We've got no treaty obligations to uphold. To this point, the United States had done a pretty good job of following Washington's old advice not to get tangled up in alliances with other countries. For just this reason, to avoid being dragged into wars and conflicts that we weren't ready to handle. But also, we felt like Europe is a long way away. It's all the way on the other side of the Atlantic. Its conflicts and concerns aren't really our problem. We're concerned with what's going on here in America. We're busy building and everything, and that's their problem, not ours. President at the time was Woodrow Wilson. He had won in 1912. You remember the election where Taft and Roosevelt sort of fought it out over the Republican vote, and then Wilson walks in as a Democrat because of the split Republican vote between the Republicans and the progressives. And so Wilson has become president, and he's busy pushing his progressive agenda, right? I mean, that's what he wants to do. It's what he was elected to do. It's what he wants to do. He says, look, we don't have time for a war. We need to act and speak in a spirit of neutrality. We need to really not just talk the talk, but we need to really walk the walk of neutrality. We can't pick sides. However, U.S. companies still sold things to the belligerent nations. Belligerent means nations in a war. Banks loaned money to them as well. And for the first few years of the war, that's going to continue until we start to pass laws that say you can't. But we did it more for the Allied powers, that would be Britain and France and Russia, than we did to the Central powers, Germany, Austria, and the Ottomans. And part of the reason for that was simply availability. The Germans had a very difficult time getting to the United States. The Royal Navy started patrolling the waters around Europe, and if they saw a German ship, they sank it. And so the Germans had difficulty coming over to the U.S. in order to get things if they were to purchase them. Meanwhile, the British have no such problems. Now, you can't, if you're a neutral, one thing you can't do is sell war materials to a belligerent nation. You can't sell them guns. You can't sell them cannon shells. You can't sell them tanks or airplanes or anything. Not that they had tanks yet, they just developed them in this war. But you can't sell them things that they would use directly for the war. You can sell, however, parts to make things from. And so we sell hollow shells that they can fill up with explosive to make cannon shells. We can sell them medicine, food. Food is a very big deal. Britain is an island that cannot feed itself. It has to import food, always has. Well, not always, but had for 100 years at this point. In order to feed itself, they've got to import food from outside. They just can't, they don't have enough farmers. And so we're helping them, but not in a direct military way, because that was against the rules, okay, of a neutral nation. You couldn't sell military items to a belligerent nation. Even if you say you'll sell them to both, that's not considered okay. World War I is fought in a variety of different parts of Europe, and each of those different areas is called a front. The Western Front, which is the one we're most concerned with because that's the one where America fights, is over in along the border between France and Germany and Belgium. So that's that side, and it's mostly going to be the British and the French and the Belgians and later the Americans against mostly the Germans, although also some Austro-Hungarians are involved there. The Eastern Front is basically Russia versus Germany and Austria. The Balkan Front is basically mostly the British, some of the Russians, but mostly it's the British versus the Ottoman Turks. And the Italian Front is going to be mostly Italy versus the Austrians, with the Serbians and the Bulgarians getting involved there as well. So as the war begins, both sides are just absolutely convinced this is going to be a short, victorious war. They have massive volunteerism in Britain and France and Germany, and everybody's just full of jingoistic patriotism. They're just in the mood to go whoop up on those bad guys and show them who's boss, and we'll all be home by Christmas. This is starting in August, so they're thinking, 3 months and this war is over. The first major battle is going to be the First Battle of the Marne, and that takes place in September. The Marne is a river in France, and the Germans start it, and they push almost to Paris. And this is that start of the von Schlieffen plan that we talked about a minute ago. And so they drive in, and they get to within 25 miles of Paris. They are freaking the French out. The French are totally shocked. They didn't think that the Germans could come through the forests that were up. It's called the Ardennes Forest in Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg that they swept through with overwhelming forces. And they get just outside of Paris. They're so close that their biggest guns, their biggest cannons can actually hit the outskirts of Paris. They've got civilian Frenchmen in Paris being handed rifles, jumping into taxis, and rushing out to the front to defend the city. That's how desperate they are. These guys aren't trained. They're not nothing. They're just like, have a rifle, protect your city, protect your homes. And they do. They stop them. It's a minor miracle that this happens. Had they not done so, had the Germans had a little bit more force there, they probably would have taken Paris. And if they had taken Paris, the French would have probably dropped out of the war, which you'll see happen in the 1940s in World War II. So they get stopped, and they start digging in. Both sides start digging in. And by the end of the year, the war on the Western Front is a stalemate. There are lines of trenches hundreds of miles long. Hundreds of miles of trench have been dug. There are multiple layers of trenches. These are some really impressive pieces of dirt moving. And it stretches from the Atlantic Ocean up near the English Channel all the way down to Italy. It's just immense. The Christmas truce was an interesting thing that happened in 1914. This early in the war, nobody has really gotten hateful yet. They haven't seen the massive losses that they're going to see over the next few years yet. And so in one part, or actually it happened in several parts, but the famous part is in one part of the lines between the Germans and the British, where they were fairly close together. Sometimes these front lines were only 100 yards apart, 200 yards apart. They got very close in some places. They had a truce, a very informal truce at Christmas. And what happened was on Christmas Eve, the story goes that the Germans were celebrating by singing Silent Night, which of course in German, not in English, but the tune is the same. It's an old German song, really. And the English soldiers began to sing along. And so they started singing Christmas carols kind of to each other from within their trenches. Then, eventually, one guy, one officer put a little white flag up on a stick and raised it and waved it around. And the other side said, "Come on out, let's talk." And they came out, and this is at night still, right? And they work their way through all the barbed wire. They've got barbed wire everywhere. And they meet in the middle. And they agree that Christmas Day, they're not going to shoot each other. And so they have this informal truce on Christmas Day, and they get out of their trenches, and they go and they talk with each other. They swap cigarettes and coffee and tea and chocolates and show pictures of their families to one another. They have all kinds of things like that go on. This is a couple of photographs that were taken during the Christmas truce. On the left, you see German and English soldiers playing a game of soccer. They called it football, but they both played the same game. It was a very popular game already by that point. They had a soccer match in no man's land. That's where they are. It's the area between the two armies there. Picture on the right is a British soldier and a German soldier, and they've gone to get Christmas trees, essentially. They went and chopped down some limbs to decorate Christmas trees. And the soldier on the right is German, and the soldier on the left with the mustache, he's English. I mean, these guys, they're virtually identical. And they get that. They understand that, yes, technically we're enemies, but we're all human beings. And the war hasn't gotten ugly yet. It will, though. It will. All right, so the Western Front is characterized by the use of positional warfare, rather than a war of maneuver. These guys aren't moving around a lot. They wish they were. It becomes a war of attrition in this case. The two armies have dug in. They have these miles and miles of trenches, and these are to protect themselves from bullets and bombs and exploding shells and things like that. They've put up mazes of barbed wire in front of their trenches. to keep the enemy from being able to rush into them. And the area between them becomes known as no man's land because really it was not a place where a man could survive. It was incredibly dangerous to try to cross that. You were out in the open and you would be shot. Soldiers ate and slept in the trenches than everything else in the trenches, if you catch my meaning. Basically, the war on the Western Front becomes a series of efforts to break through the other side's lines, to break through at some point along this line, get into the background where you can start attacking their supplies and cut off the enemy from help and supplies and get them out of communication and things so that they'll be forced to surrender to you. If you can get back there and cause that kind of havoc, you can start pushing the enemy back and force them to retreat. And that's what both sides are trying to do. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to do that. They try again and again and again, just essentially human waves across these open grounds. And it leads to just incredible bloodshed. It's incredibly expensive in terms of human lives to do that. Here's just a photo of some Australian troops they served with the British. They had been, of course, part of the British Empire for quite a while. They've got their gas masks on. This is in 1915 after gas had been introduced by the Germans. And they're getting ready to possibly make an attack. That might be a forward trench that they're in. But this is how deep these trenches were. This is not a particularly good stretch of trench. It doesn't have any boards holding up the sides and everything. They actually got quite sophisticated at sometimes because they were there for a good number of weeks and months. Part of what made getting into the enemy trenches so difficult was that it was not just a single trench. You can see here that there are actually rows of trenches. The frontline trench is just the very first one. Behind that, there's going to be a supporting trench. So you're going to have machine guns and things in that. Even further back, there would be a reserve trench. The first two trench lines would slow the enemy attack up long enough for people to come up from the reserve trench and help push them back. Meanwhile, the whole time, guys are getting caught up in the barbed wire up in the front. They're being shelled by cannons that are way behind the lines, miles back, that can't be reached. And they're just pounding onto you like that. You've got machine guns spitting bullets at you at crazy rates. And the whole area is just insanely difficult to get across. And here we have an actual photograph of a real World War I era German trench. These were Germans on this side. You can see how they've got their firing step where they're standing to look over the edge. They can step up even further. They've got a sump there for, like, if a grenade comes in, they'll kick it down into that lower part so that the blast goes upward and not into them. And they're deep. Those trenches were deep. You could walk standing up straight through them if they were as well constructed as this one. You have a little diagram there on the lower right-hand side showing sort of a cutaway version of that. The soldier is standing on what were called duck boards over the sump, which is where all of the rain and everything was supposed to collect. A lot of times all of that was missing, and they just waded around in mud as deep as their knees in some cases in their own trenches. They would be walled up with sandbags and things. Get a dugout behind him where he could dive into it if shells were coming down to help protect him from that. And then he would step up on the firing step just in front of him, rest his elbows where that elbow rest is, and shoot over the sandbags to his front. And then in the upper right, there's just a little cartoon drawn back in the day. It says, as you were supposed to be resting in a quiet spot, a little light literature goes well. They're in their dugout with all the shells going off out there, and they're just sort of calmly sitting there. These are British troops being drawn. And this is what no man's land looked like. You can see a crater up at the front of this photograph. The smaller posts in the foreground, those would have had lots and lots of barbed wire strung upon them. It looks like it's been blasted away temporarily. Those larger ones in the back, those were trees once upon a time. There's nothing left on them, you'll see, and that's from the shelling. The incredible amount of explosives and fires and things that landed in this area between the opposing lines. Millions upon millions of shells were fired, and it created an atmosphere. It looks to me, it looks virtually like the surface of the moon. It's just there's nothing living there. It's just all gone. And there's so many that were fired, and if the rains had been coming and it was a very wet kind of time, some of the shells didn't go off when they hit the ground, and they buried themselves in the ground. And even now, there are parts of France where it's not safe to go because there's unexploded shells below the surface of the ground, and they work their way up through the years. And sometimes some French farmer is just driving along plowing up his fields, and he hits one, and it goes off sometimes. All right, moving forward to 1915. In the beginning of 1915, the Germans announced that they would begin an unrestricted U-boat blockade of Great Britain. What that means is that their U-boats, that's a term for a submarine, their submarines would attack any ship in the area, in the waters around Great Britain without warning. And so they just announce that to everybody and say, stay out. And the idea is that they're trying to keep supplies, especially food, from getting to the British. Also in 1915, the Germans will use lethal gases for the very first time at what's called the Second Battle of Ypres. Yes, it's pronounced Ypres. It's French. It doesn't have to make sense. That battle goes from April to May, and they use chlorine gas is what they used, and it scared the hell out of everybody. We'll talk more about the use of gas as a weapon later on, as well as submarines for that matter. On May 7th, something very important happens, is that the British liner, this is a passenger liner, the Lusitania, was sunk by a German submarine, killing almost 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. And as a result of that, the United States is going to demand that the Germans stop their unrestricted U-boat warfare. And the Germans will for a while, because they really do not want the United States to get involved in the war. By that fall, the Allies will start what they call the Great Fall Offensive, which lasts from September through October, and they try to push the Germans back. And what happens is, well, very little. There's not really much change from 1914, and 1915 will end with the trench lines not having moved more than, in some places, not having moved at all, and in others, maybe a few miles one way or the other. But there's no real difference. Now, the sinking of the Lusitania is a very famous event. The RMS Lusitania was sunk by the German U-boat U-20 only a few hours out of port. It was almost safe into its British port. But why did Americans get so mad? Well, it was propaganda that did it. The passengers had been warned. You see here on the right-hand side an actual piece of the newspaper. The top part there is the advertisement. Cunard was the company that owned the Lusitania, the shipping line that owned the Lusitania, and they're advertising that the Lusitania will set sail on Saturday, May 1st at 10 a.m., and this is out of New York, and it will arrive Saturday, May 29th. And then they would, so this is just an advertisement for taking a trip over to Europe. And right below it, from the Imperial German Embassy in Washington, D.C. Remember, their embassy is open here. We're neutral. We're not at war with them. It says, travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, and that in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or of any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. What that means is, if we see this ship, we're going to sink it, so don't get on it, Americans. Just don't ride on it. The Lusitania was a legitimate target. She was listed in the Royal Navy as an auxiliary cruiser, so she was on the Royal Navy's ship list. She was carrying munitions. She had live ammunition shells in her hull, down in the cargo bays, down in the bottom. She was not supposed to. The British government denied for years that was true, but it's part of why she sank so fast. When she got hit with a torpedo, it set off some of that ammunition inside the ship as well. It blew a great big hole in the boat, and it sank. Her sinking was entirely legal and legitimate. The Germans did not do anything wrong. But the British control access to information going to America, and their propaganda machine spins it hard. They even say that German schools were closed to celebrate the sinking of the Lusitania. Yes, Germany closed all of their schools to celebrate the sinking of one not terribly large non-military ship. No, that did not happen. The British said that they had made special medals for the U-boat sailors who had sunk the Lusitania. Also did not happen. But Americans got that news, and it made us very angry. We were mad because civilians had been killed, and of course that's troubling, but even more mad that we believed that the Germans were laughing at us, as if we had no power, that we were of no consequence whatsoever. And Americans, as you know, don't like that. 1916 is one of the pivotal years of this war. It is the year in which the death toll will be the highest. In 2 battles alone, over 800,000 people became casualties. Now, casualty doesn't necessarily mean dead. That's dead, wounded seriously, captured, or missing. Basically, no longer in the fight. Some of those missing were missing because they had been obliterated when they were killed. If one of those big cannon shells landed right on top of you, there wasn't anything left to find. Some of them deserted and ran off and hid. But mostly this is dead and wounded, and about 3 times as many wounded as dead. But a lot of people died in these 2 battles. The Battle of Verdun, which was a fortified town in France, in February of 1916, where each side lost more than 300,000, and the Battle of the Somme, in which each side suffered more than 500,000 casualties. So that's 1.6 million men total, because each side had 800,000-ish casualties. News of this comes to the U.S., and we're having an election in November of 1916. And Woodrow Wilson, who is the incumbent, has run on his record of keeping us out of the war. And that helps him get reelected. People are looking at these massive casualty lists, and they're very glad that Wilson has kept us out of the war, because we don't want to be part of all of that. So Wilson was reelected in November of 1916. The Germans in February will resume unrestricted U-boat warfare. The war is not going well for Germany. They are, in some ways, doing well. They've done very well on the Eastern Front, but on the Western Front, the attrition is just bleeding Germany dry. They've been cut off from a lot of supplies. The people are hungry. The soldiers are hungry. Their equipment is wearing out. They can't replace a lot of it. They're starting to get very concerned about their ability to continue this war. And so they gamble on a very risky move and resume their unrestricted U-boat warfare, hoping to do to Britain what the British have been doing to them and choke them out first. Partly as a result of that, we will declare war on Germany on April 6th of 1917. So just a few months after Wilson is re-inaugurated, we will declare war on Germany. It's not a unanimous declaration. Not everybody in Congress votes for it. One person in particular is Jeannette Rankin. She was the first woman ever elected to Congress, and she votes against it. She's a dedicated pacifist, and so she votes against the declaration of war. She will be back in office in 1941 when Franklin Roosevelt asks for a declaration of war against Japan, and she will again vote against it. This time she's the only one who does. But in World War I in 1917, she's not alone, but she does vote against it. In 1917, the French army, tired of the massive losses that they've been taking under the leadership of a couple of French generals named Foch and Joffre, basically just refused to attack. They get ordered to begin an offensive, to lead an attack, and they simply say, no, we're not going to. And, of course, this freaks the French out. A new fella takes over the army, a guy by the name of Pétain. That's how it's pronounced. P-E-T-A-I-N is Pétain. And he had been the general at the Battle of Verdun. And he was well respected by the French because they knew that he didn't order attacks that had little chance of succeeding. And by 1917, we've had 3 years of the basic thing of, well, run across the fields and hopefully you'll get in this time. They'll never expect it 28 times in a row, kind of thing. And getting shot to pieces when you do it. They're tired of it. And Pétain is like, no, we're not going to do that anymore. So he takes command, restores order, and the French army comes back into control. They were perfectly willing to defend themselves. If the Germans attacked, they fought back, but they were not going over the top, and they simply refused to do it for a while. Another big thing that happens in 1917, and this is very important, is that the Russian Revolution will take Russia out of the war. The Russians have, over on the Eastern Front, just lost literally millions of men. We'll talk about the Eastern Front later this week. We're almost done with this Western Front stuff, but they've been just wiped out. And the Russians will actually end up having a political revolution. The communists will take over, the Bolsheviks will take over in Russia and kick out the Tsar, and they will withdraw from the war. Okay, this is very good news for Germany when that happens, because now they no longer have that dreaded two-front war. All of the soldiers that they had fighting in Russia can now turn around and come over to fight in France. And that's very scary for the Allies, because now they've got all of these victorious veteran soldiers that are going to come over and try to hammer them on the West. 1918 is going to be the last year of the fighting. It starts off very well for Germany. The Russians signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918. This officially ends the war between Russia and Germany, and the Germans can send all of their soldiers over to the West, which they do, and they mass them up and they set a coordinated large attack. However, at the same time, American troops have finally arrived in large numbers. We've got over 1 million American soldiers there now. It took us a while to get a bunch of guys into the service, trained and equipped and everything, because remember, we had such a small army before the war started, and we hadn't really built up those forces until the war is declared. So it's not until really early 1918 that we're ready to truly help. And we do. The two biggest battles that we fight in at first are Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood. And at those places, American troops who really, we're kind of, the British and the French look at us like we're crazy because we're doing stuff that they figured out years before was a bad idea, and yet somehow we make it work in some cases. In some cases it's disastrous, but in some ways we make things work. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're fresh. The Europeans have been fighting this war now for almost 4 years. They're tired. They are worn out. They've been sick, they've been battered, they're hungry, their equipment is worn out. And here we come, well-fed, young men, strong, healthy, well-equipped, not as experienced, but trained and high morale. And we come in and we stop that last German attack, and then we become part of the last major offensive of the war, where we push the Germans back. We finally begin to push them out of the trench lines in the west and start moving them backward out of France, out of Belgium, back to the German border. They get across the border. And at that point, Germany says, okay, we give up. The Allies do not invade Germany. That turns out to be a mistake later on. But at this time, the decision is made to not invade Germany itself, just to push the Germans back into their home and stop the fighting. And so the armistice will be signed on November 11th, and it goes into effect at 11 a.m. So in the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns that had started back in August of 1914 will finally fall silent, ending the fighting of the Great War on the Western Front and essentially ending World War I. And I think that's a good stopping spot for us for today. We'll continue discussion of the war on Wednesday. Have a good night.